Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archaeoviking. Today, I'm joined again by my friend and fellow historian, Beofeld, to debunk some common myths about the medieval world. Now, before we get into this video, I will state that we're only focusing on 10 myths, as you can see in this title, because as Beofeld and can both tell you, there's quite a lot of them. There's quite a lot of myths about really any period of time that you can find, uh, all of which require much more depth than we can provide. So, for the sakes of this video, he and I have narrowed it down to 10 of the most common myths about the medieval world. So, with that, let's hop right into the. Actually, before that, Bayfield, do you have anything you want to add into what I was talking about in terms of, you know, how complex the subject of even the medieval world is?
Yeah, well, to be perfectly honest, you could have chosen even one of these and
Yeah,
written a book about it.
yeah,
The We're also going to be these are more necessarily like broad themes than they
yeah.
are individual myths too.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. 'Cause in fact, there have been books written on. They're in my reading list, like for example, on just sex in the medieval world.
Huh.
Or bathing, or anything like that.
Oh yes.
Marriage. There's several books that are like this thick, about marriage. So yeah. So there's a reason we narrowed it down to 10 myths that are going to be relatively broad, but we'll go into as much depth as we reasonably can. All right. So with that, we're going to our first myth, and I would argue the absolute most common myth you will run into about the medieval world. Period. The Dark Ages. So roughly, the Dark Ages is the idea that after the Roman Empire fell, supposedly at the hands of Germanic barbarians, uh, there was essentially utter chaos and no real order to things. Essentially, Europe was in total disarray and was completely backwards until some say until the Renaissance, others say until Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. That being said, that's not actually the case. For one thing, the Roman Empire didn't actually fall. The Eastern Roman Empire, often called the Byzantine Empire, uh, kept going on until 1453. Uh, and in fact, not just that, in the 500s, Emperor Justinian, is seen in this map, led a massive military campaign to reconquer much of the Western Roman Empire that you see here. And he did it very well because essentially the Roman Empire were professionally trained soldiers, and everyone else was, while not necessarily is backwards as one has would describe the Germanic tribes. Oftentimes, they were also nowhere near as trained or well equipped as the Roman Empire. Um, they or the Sassanid Persian Empire. These were the two sort of big figures at the time. But even if we put the Byzantine Empire to the side, we can also see the Germanic tribes creating their own successor states to the Roman Empire. First of all, the Visigoths and their cousins, the Ostrogoths, as well as the Vandals, uh, proceeded pretty early on to take over Roman territory, with the Vandals and Visigoths doing it first, followed by the Ostrogoths, and they themselves sort of modeled themselves after the Roman Empire. In fact, the Ostrogoths claimed to be the Roman Empire. The Ostrogoths were like, "We're the Roman emperors now." So you can argue all day about whether or not they actually were, but it doesn't change the fact that that's what they were claiming, and they were using Roman trappings, Roman culture, Roman laws, etc., to build their kingdom. Same with the Visigoths and the Vandals. Uh, you also had the Anglo-Saxons and such, and I'll pass it off to Beofeld here, who is a specialist in that.
Well, let's just say that society kept going on. We see a proliferation of the same sorts of things that we had seen under the Roman Empire. It's just under a slightly smaller scale. The power was still consolidated. It just wasn't consolidated in such a huge span as the Roman Empire was. But we also have to consider that the Roman Empire had been failing for quite some time to live up to that same sort of um, standard that it had been. So you're looking at hundreds of years of decline, but not really a bang for the end, but lots of tiny little whimpers as individual portions break off and do their own things. Uh, when we look at the Anglo-Saxons, we can see that they are forming what would be a prototype for this form of society that we would see later on in the Middle Ages. So these Dark Ages, as we have tended to call them, these Middle Ages, we see those inklings beginning across Europe. But Anglo-Saxons have a particularly nice example because you can see that the lords would come in and carve out little kingdoms um, and they would need vassals to be able to maintain them.
Yeah. And I also want to add on the Britons, it would eventually become the Welsh, and also the Britons over here in crap, what is it called? Uh,
Is that Cornwall?
Cornwall. Thank you, Cornwall. So the Britons in Wales and Cornwall uh, were the Romans, the
Yes,
Romano Britons. They
they
now
were.
now to be fair, a lot of Romano Britons intermixed rather easily with the Anglo-Saxons. Now, there was warfare, but it was not an Anglo-Saxon conquest like a lot of people tend to think it is, as Beofeld could probably go hours on about. But, but it was a little bit of both. It was a mix. So, for example, one Anglo-Saxon king, not Fredegurn, uh, what was it, his name? Yeah, I think it was Frigger. Um, who like he made alliances with. Oh, it was the king at Beofeld who made alliances with Hengist and Horsa. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, he made alliances with Anglo-Saxon kings or warlords, Hengist and Horsa, and gained a lot of territory. Because of that. But then you had others like a mysterious figure in Wales, who we know is maybe the basis for King Arthur, who went by the name the Bear or Arthur. Uh, Arthur is just Celtic for bear, so we don't know what his name actually was necessarily. But he was warring with the Saxons, and we know several other Welsh warlords were warring with the Saxons as well. So essentially, when the Saxons came in, you see some mixing, and then those who didn't mix, went into Wales and Cornwall, um, and essentially cut themselves off from the rest of the island. Not literally, I mean they still traded and such, but there was a definite distinct sort of division between those who were with the Saxons and those who weren't.
and that division became more pronounced over time. For
Yeah,
instance, you get to the time of Offa, and you get Offa's Dyke,
yeah,
and things like that. The Dyke being there
yeah,
to essentially protect against the Welsh.
yeah, exactly, exactly, yeah, and uh, was it and then also you see this sort of division continue well into the really into the Norman conquest, because Wales was still separate from Britain when for example Edward Longshanks, the first, began invading Wales.
Right.
So
Yeah, the supposed conquest of the Anglo-Saxons of England
yeah,
is truthfully more of a cultural conquest than a conquest by which the people were completely overturned.
Yeah,
They, in a sense, they do end up losing what had been their previous language.
yeah,
Over time, that language disappears. There's not really very much intermingling. There's some, but not very much. For
yeah,
instance, there's a few notable words like druid that maintained itself, and then the alternate word for badgers, which would be brock.
oh,
Um, so some words like that that had been introduced from the Britons.
yeah,
But for the most part, the language and culture of the people that had been there is overturned, and we
yeah,
don't know precisely the extent to which it might have been um, forced, or the extent to which it might have just been uh, the uh, the people that took over had been the ones in charge, and everyone was then mimicking them. So
yeah,
we don't know to the extent of that.
yeah, exactly. And I just double checked the name. It was Vortigern, not Fritigern. Vortigern.
Yeah, Vortigern.
Yeah. So now, this we can take this model that we see here for the Anglo-Saxons, and we can actually apply that also to the Franks, because a very similar thing happened to the Franks when they began to migrate into what is now Gaul, or what was originally Gaul, what is now France. They would actually split up into various different kingdoms. A lot of this had to do with a Frankish sort of custom of when a father dies, he divides the kingdom between uh his inheritance between his sons, all of his sons, and that would be tend to what happened. So like there's this mysterious individual named Merovich who led the Franks into Gaul and supposedly conquered a huge chunk of it for himself, and then he promptly divided it between his sons, and then that would just be repeated throughout the Merovingian Frank, essentially history. Clovis, the first big Frankish king that we know of, he did that. He conquered much of Gaul, and then he proceeded to divide it between his sons. And so it's a very similar thing that happened to England, but also a little bit different. Where it's different is while that division was there, it also sort of allowed for a much more easily unifiable uh, kingdom, uh, because everyone was related, and you could, in theory, marry off, or just take it for yourself eventually. Or if you only had one son, then it would pass on just to that one son. And that's sort of where it begins to change. Is eventually uh, an individual by the name of Charles Martel, or Charles the Hammer, begins to sort of rise to prominence. And then, even though he's not king, his son, Pepin the First, uh, would decide, why are we, with, like, they were called governors called governors of the palace. And so it was like, governor of the palace is you were the de facto one in charge, but the king was the real person in charge. So essentially, you do all the work for the king. And so Pippin was like, "Why am I doing this? Why am I doing all the work for a guy and getting none of the benefits?" So he actually asked the Pope for permission to overthrow the current Merovingian king. Got permission, or supposedly got permission. Whether or not that's true is up for debate. But he got, air quotes, permission, and then proceeded to overthrow the king and took the throne for himself, which led to the Carolingian Empire, because Pepin's son, sorry, Louis the Pious, not Pepin, Louis the Pious. Oh wait, no, that was son. Yeah, Pepin's son Charlemagne took the throne, and then he proceeded to go on a conquering spree. He conquered Italy. He conquered Brittany. He conquered Saxony. He did everything, and they essentially built a massive empire, and then modeled it after the Roman Empire. Um, and then again, this is where the if you have one son comes in, because when he died, he passed the kingdom on to his son Louis the Pious. who was able to hold on to a singular kingdom for a lot longer. So there's that. So this is, in fact, this is where the Holy Roman Empire originally got its name, because Charlemagne was called the Holy Roman Emperor. So yeah, it doesn't really sound like the Roman Empire fell that much to me. You know,
It's morphing.
yeah, it's
It's
morphing. Yeah,
Rome by that point had become more of an idea
yeah,
than it had an actual empire.
yeah,
And so Rome, the empire, had this intangible idea quality for these people. And to be
mm,
honest, it still has that same idea quality today. You
yep,
don't find very many of our modern day empires that aren't in some way patterning themselves, their culture, their architecture, off the grandeur of Rome.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, and a good example of
so
that is our next group, the Islamic conquests, because the Islamic caliphates, as they began to spread out and conquer their area, also began to model their kingdoms and empires off of Rome, uh, taking a lot of cities like Alexandria and such that used to be actually under the Byzantine Roman Empire for themselves, and then begin modeling a lot of their culture off of it. So there's that too. And then we had actually, you want to add on? Want to add on to the Islamic Caliphate, Beofeld?
just that the extent of the spread of this empire that they were creating is this Alexander the Great level of
Yeah.
speed of conquest.
Yes.
And that this level of conquest that we're looking at here is really under uh, underrepresented in Western history,
Ah,
just because it's not in the forefront. It's
yeah.
not thought of, but when one looks at these dates, that's a pretty big spread of conquest.
Yeah.
This is pretty extreme imperialism.
Yeah. And a lot of it had to do with is if we go back a few slides here, just a couple of slides to this map right here, a lot of that had to do with the actual surviving Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, and the Sassanid Persian Empire essentially being incredibly weak, because the Byzantine and Sassanid Empire, basically having no one else that could match their military mights, used each other as punching bags for around 300 years. So the uh, by the time the Muslim conquest began to happen, the two empires that could have stood in their way were in no shape to actually fight against them. Furthermore, they also used a lot of Arab Muslim mercenaries in their armies. And so when the Muslim conquests happened, a lot of these soldiers and commanders had actually been trained in some variation of Roman military tactics. So it was a case of essentially Rome and the Sassanid Persian Empire made their own worst enemies. You know, they made their own weapon to be used against them. And so that's why they were able to sort of spread so quickly, is they were just like, oh, you're in no shape to fight me. Like you've been beaten the crap out of by Mike Tyson and Bruce Lee, and now I'm gonna come in here 5 minutes after you've gotten the living crap kicked out of you, and and be like, yeah, this is all mine now. You know, which is eventually what happened. The Byzantine Empire did a bit better than the Sassanid Persian Empire, but again, looking at this map, you can see that it didn't go so well for either of them. And then as I said, the Muslim caliphates proceeded to model themselves to varying degrees off of Rome. In fact, during the Crusades, a lot of the knowledge that would eventually lead to the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance, came from Muslim cities. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on, but they came from Muslim cities like Damascus and Jerusalem and Alexandria and things like that. So, and then you had other kingdoms that sort of were not quite as impactful or did not inherit Roman trappings as much as the ones we mentioned previously, but they definitely did inherit some. For example, the Avar Empire, the Avars being a group of Mongolic, Turco-Mongolic people from, Mongolia, who had migrated in only like, I think 50 years was like the last estimate I saw in an archaeological paper, to the area of Eastern Europe, and as you can see in this map, essentially took over all of Eastern Europe. And until Charlemagne eventually defeated them for good, they were sort of with the exception of the Muslim caliphates, they were the big threat to Europe. But the point I want to drive home is they took over much of what would have been the Roman Empire, as you can see here, and then they would be succeeded by the Bulgarian Empire, the Bulgars being another Turco-Mongolic people who would eventually come in and permanently for several hundred years take over this huge chunk of Eastern Europe, and would begin to actually model themselves eventually off of the Byzantine Empire. So as you can see, while the Roman Empire did quote unquote fall to a point, air quotes, it also sort of did it. Like Beofeld said, it was an idea. And for one thing, the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, never actually fell during this period of time. But the Western Roman Empire, while it did sort of fall, it also just sort of evolved because various different kingdoms came in, took the idea of it, and began to model themselves after it. So there really was no Dark Ages like you would see in, say, I don't know, Monty Python and the Quest for the Holy Grail, or Vikings or something like that. Now this leads us to our next section, the domination of Christianity, which is a very big myth. So the myth goes that essentially during the Dark Ages, all of the religions went to the wayside, and Christianity was there because it was better and than all the other religions, and et cetera, et cetera. And while there's some minor truth to that, because Rome had converted Christianity during that period of time, it was not the only religion in existence, nor was it necessarily the biggest one at the time. We tend to think, because of our modern world, with Christianity being the what is thought of as the largest religion in our modern world, we tend to take that view and impose it on the medieval world. When it took really until about the late Middle Ages for that to finally change and turn to Christianity becoming more and more prominent. Because during this period of time, for one thing, you had Germanic paganism, which was very large until about 1100, give or take, AD or CE. And even then, in some places like the Baltic areas, like Lithuania and things like that, variations of different pagan religions like Germanic paganism or Slavic paganism continued. Actually, in the case of the Baltic regions, they continued well until the 1400s and 1500s. So that's something that's important to remember. But not even that. When we think of Christianity, we tend to overlook the other big religion that was making gains during that period of time, Islam. Islam arguably was a bigger religion in the Middle Ages than Christianity was. I mean, look at the territory they held versus the territory that Christian kingdoms held. And Islam was, in many ways, a lot more lenient than Christianity was during the Middle Ages. Would you say that's an accurate assessment, Beofeld?
It's 50-50.
Yeah, 50-50.
The Christianity was never lenient. Let's just put it like that. But it's 50-50 on Islam.
Yeah.
And it depends on
Sorry, you cut out.
Islam was it depends on the time period and place as well.
Yeah.
But Islam was never particularly lenient on anything it deemed to be sort of pagan.
No, no.
It was somewhat lenient for Christianity and Judaism, depending on time and place.
Yes, yes, that yeah, thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, which yeah, and you're exactly right. Yeah, because there were laws that they would allow anyone who's Christian or Jewish to stay in their kingdoms um as long as they paid a tax, which is something that Christian kingdoms never did. Uh ever. Um
Yeah, well, it turned out to be a particularly nice
yeah,
thing for Islam
yeah,
because you essentially you have a bunch of people who try to evade the tax
yeah,
by pretending to be Muslim. Well,
yep,
you'll only have to pretend for one generation before the children of those people who were pretending actually are Muslim.
yep,
And so, that whole thing, fake it till you make it, well, that sort of ended up actually being what happened.
yep,
So the people who were attempting to avoid the tax were faking it until their children made it. And then you have a very thoroughly converted area.
yeah, exactly, exactly. So yeah, exactly, and that's why also again one could argue that Islam was most definitely a larger religion at this point in time than Christianity was. Now this would eventually begin to change, like as like the High and Late Middle Ages began to uptake, and European kingdoms began to become larger and more unified. But for much of the medieval period, Islam was the big boy on the block because for one thing, we're only looking at when I'm talking about this. At first, we were only talking about Europe, but when you take into account Central Asia and well into Central Africa as well, and Southeast Asia and India and such, Islam was spreading all over the place. Whereas Christianity, while it had spread a little bit like into China with an Nestorian Christianity and such, it had nowhere near made the same gains in those areas that Islam had. So
Well, let me put this into perspective perhaps a little bit.
yeah,
Um, Islam hasn't made as many drastic gains in area since this time.
yeah, since this time.
Uh, the only reason that Christianity is larger today is because of the population of South America
Yeah,
and North America uh, having been converted to Christianity. If you were to look at the areas where Islam occupied at that point in time versus all of Christendom
yeah,
before the colonization of the New World,
yeah.
um, Islam would have occupied this vast territory with lots of people in it.
Yeah, exactly. And then that also sort of brings me into our next one, because there were two other religions that were much larger than Christianity during most of the medieval period, and those were Buddhism and Taoism um, in East Asia. Buddhism actually still to this day holds a massive territory, mostly in Asia, but still, it's the fourth largest religion today, with Hinduism being the third. But it was massive. It took hold in Southeast Asia. It took hold in East Asia, like Mongolia and China, Japan and Korea, all of which had huge populations, which we'll get into in a little bit. But they were these. This was after Islam, the other sort of big religion on the block, and it was very appealing to a lot of people, especially um, uh, Zen or Chan Buddhism, because of the idea that you could escape the suffering of the world. Now, Chan Buddhism is different from sort of what you would think as traditional Buddhism, because traditional Buddhism or Theravada Buddhism tend to be like, oh, you need to meditate and remove yourself from suffering. You need to let go of all of your worldly wants and desires and things like that. And it's very individualistic. Now, it's not necessarily that much that is individualistic as people tend to think, um, but it's much more individualistic than even, for example, Islam and Christianity. Chan Buddhism, which is the Buddhism that really began to take hold in much of East Asia, was the idea of embedded the idea of benevolence into it. So this is where we get the ideas of, for example, bodhisattvas, or individuals who rose to the title of Buddhahood, but decided to forgo reaching nirvana so that they can come back and help other human beings achieve, um, reach the Pure Lands, as it was called, where like sort of like a heavenly plane where all suffering is gone, it's beautiful, etc., etc. So that's very appealing to people. It's like, oh, I'm, if as long as I'm compassionate and etc., etc., as well as leaving behind my all my worldly, wants and sufferings, I can go to a better place. So that's why Buddhism really took hold in much of the world. And then Taoism was very similar. Taoism actually had a lot of very similar ideas, but went about them different ways. So I'm not going to go too much into that, but like Taoism is where you get deities like the Queen Mother of the West or the Jade Emperor and things like that in Taoist immortals, where again the idea is by doing certain things you could achieve immortality and essentially leave suffering behind. So that's why these two religions became so big in East Asia. And I'm including this because when we think of the medieval world, we tend to think of only Europe, when it's like, oh, well, Europe is not the only place that existed during the medieval period at all. So there is that, which actually,
So
oh, sorry, go back to what you're going to say.
what I was going to say is that I would actually use the term here for this uh, Chinese folk religion,
Yeah, Chinese
which is
folk religion.
still one of the largest religions that there is.
Yeah,
It's just it's not particularly well accounted for.
no, it's not. Yeah,
Um, and so Taoism is this philosophy that's overlaid and intertwined with Chinese folk religion.
yeah,
But the it's alive and well,
yeah.
is something that I would say.
Yes, and same with Buddhism. Both of these are alive and well, and still have massive. I don't want to say strangleholds because strangleholds makes it sound like it's a bad thing, but they have massive amounts of territory in East Asia and Buddhism in particular. When I'm about to talk about this in Southeast Asia, Buddhism and Hinduism, which I could have also included, was more into Southeast Asia, but Hinduism tended to stay in South Asia and Southeast Asia, whereas Taoism and Buddhism both expanded into other places, not just Southeast Asia.
Yeah,
Uh,
and another thing is that sometimes these are not always mutually
no,
exclusive either,
no,
which is why you can have things like Zen Buddhism existing at the same time as Shintoism.
exactly, exactly,
And someone who is a practitioner of Chinese folk religion who also then has elements of Buddhism that they practice as well.
exactly, exactly. So, and while we're at the subject of Europe not being the only place that existed during the medieval period, one of the other very dominant religions during this period of time was the Mesoamerican religion, which was practiced by cultures like the Olmec or the Maya, as seen in this mural, eventually the Aztec, or more properly known, the Triple Alliance, and things like that. And again, these were very large religions that encompassed a very large area. And while, for example, in North America, this religion was not necessarily the de facto religion, it had several different shared commonalities. Like the hero twins is a very common religious motif in Native American religions throughout all of the Americas. In fact, there are some very good studies talking about this and doing linguistic and oral history studies and testing showing that the hero twin myth goes back basically since the settlement of the Americas. So that's something that I think is all important to point out by bringing this up, because again, even if we include Asia, a lot of times when people hear, the medieval world and don't just think of Europe, America still tends to be left out. And it's like, well, the Americas existed and they were not in stagnation. And so, of course, we have to keep in mind that Native American religions, like the Mesoamerican religion, were very much very large and were very influential in their regions, which was not just Mesoamerica, it was all over the place. So there's that. Also, something I wanted to point out: atheists existed. The atheists are not a modern invention. Atheists and religious skeptics existed well back into the Roman period, if not before. One of my favorite examples of this is the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, who ruled the German inception of the Holy Roman Empire, not the Frankish version, because there were actually two versions. It's a very complicated thing that we can't get into in this video. It deserves its own video. But the King of Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire as it was called at the time, Frederick II, was notorious for being an atheist, or at the very least a religious skeptic. In fact, it was the reason that he was excommunicated at one point in time. So that's something that's very important to note, is that atheism and religious skepticism is not a modern invention. As much as Christians would love to think that is not the case. They existed back then and will probably keep existing as long as religion exists.
Well, one thing that I will add here is that a lot of times people are able to get away with something if
Yeah,
they're in positions of power and authority
yeah,
or extreme wealth.
that is
And
true too.
so atheism was not particularly well accepted if you're a commoner at this point in
No,
time.
no, it was
You,
not.
you, you probably ended up dead.
Yeah, probably. Or you hit it very well.
Oh yeah, yeah. You go to mass or else.
Yeah, exactly. But regardless of that, they still existed, and that Frederick the Great is one of the best examples of that, because he's just like he and the Pope fought each other tooth and nail over this. So, very very interesting subject that I will eventually get to in a later video to go in more depth. But yeah, okay,
Now, let's
now
actually go back. I want to talk more about the religion bit.
okay, go ahead. Yeah,
So, one of the things that I'd actually like to
uh,
religion of Christianity itself.
yeah,
Am I cutting out?
yeah. You cut out a second.
So the religion of Christianity itself, we have to understand one really important factor,
Mhm.
and it's that this was not an accessible religion.
No,
So at this point in time that we're talking about here, it was almost exclusively practiced in Latin,
yeah,
and the common people did not usually understand Latin. They understood their own languages. And so the religion is being shown to them and spoken to them in a way that they can't actually understand. And so, at best, the people who were Christian were very bad Christians
yeah,
because they had no concept of very much of the religion except that there was a God and there were later portions of its saints,
yeah,
uh, and that they were you know doing
yeah.
that sort of stuff.
Exactly.
But they continued to have folk practices which preserved elements of paganism uh, that are then studied by us. Um, but let's just put it like this: they were very bad Christians
Yeah,
from the perceptions and perspectives of the time.
yeah, and I think that's a very good thing to point out. And that's also why we still see a lot of very pagan-y or pagan adjacent things still existing well into the 1500s and 1600s, and even 1700s a little bit. So, which
Right.
I've talked about in other videos before. So, all right. So now to what I would argue is the second most common, second or third. You could argue either way depending on one of the other myths that we'll talk about in a minute. But one of the two or three most common myths about the Middle Ages, and that is the existence of knights in shining armor. So when we hear knights in shining armor, we tend to think of like the sort of Arthurian, like the Le Morte d'Arthur sort of style knight, like you see here in this, maidens who are in need of help and rescuing from, like, say, a dragon or a giant or something like that. And this brave knight, like you see here, riding off to battle this evil figure and save them, which is not actually the furthest thing from the truth. Now, I will state there were some laws later in the high to late Middle Ages that were sort of created to, I guess, give the knights some sort of guideline or like rules of war, such as the truce and the peace of God, where one was like, oh, you don't fight on Sunday, and the other one was you don't kill prisoners of war. But they were used very sparingly and were not very common. They were a very specific thing that happened at a very specific time in the medieval period. Knights are based off of or arose from actually armored cavalry that one were used during the Roman period, but were used especially by the Frankish military, the Merovingians and eventually the Carolingians, as well as, of course, the Byzantine Empire and things like that. But they were originally just heavily armored cavalry, like you see here, using chain mail or scale mail or some variation of that. And this sort of variation of armored cavalry would continue well into the Norman conquests of England. And it's important to note, if we go back to this picture a little bit, the Carolingian and Merovingian armored infantry and armored cavalry were based off of Roman military formations. These were not things that they necessarily came up with by themselves. Many of the Germanic tribes that would succeed the Western Roman Empire had been trained by the Roman Empire as soldiers and mercenaries. And they, again, going back to our very first part of the video, began to emulate the Roman Empire. And of course, part of that was like, well, we know how the Roman military worked. We know why it worked. So we're going to try to base our armies off of this. And that's one of the reasons that the Merovingians and eventually the Carolingian Franks became so effective and were able to become one of the dominant powers in Western Europe, is because of their emulation of the Roman military force. Where we get the idea, I would argue, of the knight in shining armor originated, I would argue, happened with the inception of the knightly military orders, such as the most famous, of course, being the Knights Templar, followed by the Knights of Malta, or the Hospitaller Knights, as well as the Teutonic Knights and things like that. But it's important to note, again, these knights were not knights in shining armor off rescuing damsels in distress. These were military orders. These were soldiers who were off conquering and doing battle. Now, to be fair, some, like the Teutonic Knights and the Knights Hospitallers, or the Knights of Malta, originated as, hospitals. The Hospitallers got their name because they were originally just people who had a few hospitals or medical structures during the Crusades, but they eventually became more and more militarized. And that's a very simplification. There's much more to it, but the long and short of it is they eventually became militarized and became the Knights of Malta. The same for the Teutonic Knights. So while they match the pictorial definition of knight in shining armor, they were very much not the fiction definition of knights in shining armor. And nothing makes this more evident than when the Teutonic Knights eventually, through the 1260s and 1400s, decided, like, hey, we want a kingdom of our own. And so they proceeded to march into what is now modern day Prussia, conquer it, and they proceeded to launch several so-called Northern Crusades throughout the Baltic regions of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, under the guise of converting the pagans. But in reality, they were state building. They were creating their own kingdoms because the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order wanted to be a king himself. So no, these were not these were not good people. They were not necessarily bad people either, because they're human. But these were not King Arthur's court. They were mercenaries. They were mercenaries who did what they wanted when they wanted. So there is that. Okay, so Beofeld, do you have anything you want to add to my description on the knights and their conduct and military and things like that during this period of time?
Yeah. So let's see where where was I talking about? Um, so these individuals, they're not particularly knightly as we would consider them.
Yeah.
Their loyalty extended only so far as their ability to remain paid,
Yeah.
in a sense. And we see multiple examples of the knights and barons and everything else that would rise up against the king when it suited them.
Yeah.
Uh, and um, and so the idea of the knights in shining armor doing these courtly things is something that we really need to sort of like dispel, because it's just not true.
Yeah.
And instead, um, feudalism needs to be sort of understood as the knights being essentially the mercenary force of the lords.
Yeah. Well, and I would say, and there as always, there are exceptions to the rule. One of the exceptions, sort of, was the knight, uh, oftentimes called sort of the quote unquote greatest knight, William the Marshal. And that's because William the Marshal was a retainer for a very loyal retainer, oftentimes at his own expense, to five consecutive kings of England. So he became a retainer first of Henry the Young Prince, the son of Henry II. Then he participated in a rebellion with Henry the Young Prince against Henry II, lost the rebellion, became a loyal retainer to Henry II, again staying loyal to a fault, and then fighting against a rebellion started by Henry the Young Prince's younger brother, Richard the First, the Lionhearted. This time lost to Richard the Lionhearted. Richard the Lionhearted was a much better military commander than his older brother. To put this in perspective, his older brother and William the Marshal were, by all accounts, best friends, that would go all throughout continental Europe. Because during this time, England had no tournaments. They go out throughout all continental Europe, essentially racking up win after win after win in knightly tournaments. So Henry the Young Prince was a good quote unquote knight. Richard the Lionheart was a good general. There is a difference. So he lost to Richard the Lionhearted, and then became a loyal retainer to Richard the Lionhearted. In fact, William the Marshal and Richard the Lionhearted were equals in terms of both physical prowess and strategic prowess. They were both very good generals. And William the Marshal stayed loyal to Richard the Lionhearted to a fault against his brother, Richard Lionheart's brother, John Lackland, King John. And then, and then, when Richard Lionheart died and King John ascended to the throne, he was loyal to a fault to King John, with one minor exception, because at one point in time, William Marshal was sort of making kingdom making himself. He had made major territorial gains into Wales, personal territorial gains, not gains for England, but personal territorial gains into Wales and Ireland. And John Lackland, King John, did not like that, and so he began to attack William Marshall's holdings in Ireland, and William Marshall was held prisoner in London. But William Marshall's forces won the Civil War, and William Marshall was reinstated and again became a very loyal retainer to King John, and actually led the uh, English forces against the Barons' Rebellion against King John, and then became a loyal retainer to King John's son Henry III. Uh, so so he's a prime example of what one would expect a knight to be, but again, he's the exception to the rule. And even then, as we talked about, he was not against turning against his king if it suited him. He did it twice. And in fact, when he was an early knight, his lord that he had received his knighthood from, I forget if he was killed or something like that, but his territory was taken over, and William Marshall became essentially a knight errant or a knight errant. I've heard it pronounced both ways, and he began to just go sort of by himself, lordless, throughout Europe. Again, beginning to rack up his tournament victories, which is where he met Henry the Young King. So if you lost your lord, you as a knight could just leave and do whatever the hell you wanted. You were still a knight. So yeah, so there are exceptions to the rule, but by and large, knights were their own men if they chose to be. So, all right. So now to one of the very common myths about the Middle Ages that is right up there with the Dark Ages and the Knights in Shining Armor, the supposed lack of medicine. So we think of the Middle Ages, oftentimes people think of the Middle Ages as this time where there was no medicine, where people were dying, and it's just like, oh no, I've caught a cold, and then plops over dead or something like that, and people are like, we've all seen the meme where it's like, uh I'm going to slap him 40 times on the face with a sprig of parsley, and if he dies, God wants him to die, which is like, but that's not, and that's the idea that people tend to think of when it comes to the Middle Ages, but that's not really how that worked. For example, health, like the body was studied in Europe and all over the world for centuries. They studied it in medieval universities that we'll talk about in a little bit. As you can see here, with this just dissection of a body to study its components and things like that. And we actually see medical documents, medical treatises like Anglo-Saxon leechcraft, which, and I will pass this off to Beofeld in a second because this is right up his wheelhouse, but where you see things like in its leechdoms, work cutting and starcraft, where you see remedies for things like headache, a salve for fly venom, things to help with cardiac disease, etc., etc. And you can pause to read it in more detail, but they were actually thinking of ways to treat these things. They weren't just like, oh, let's leave it up to God, which is where I will now leave it off to Beofeld.
So in a sense,
You cut out
when it comes to medicine today,
yeah.
am I able to be heard now?
Yes, you are. Yeah.
All right. So in a sense, we're spoiled in today's world. And the reason that we're spoiled is because we have antibiotics. Um, it was not so long ago when the things that we were doing medically were not very different from the medicine of the Middle Ages. So if you were to go back to just before the invention of antibiotics, we were still practicing a medicine that was startlingly similar to the medicine of the Middle Ages in many respects. And so we're spoiled today by having the ability to kill germs with antibiotics. That said, they had medicine. They had medicine that was remarkably effective in many ways, uh, and it was very scientific. Uh, if you were to look at the ways in which some of these things were put together, it's astounding. Um, but it was not similar to modern medicine, and so
Mm.
it seems foreign to us. Um, but I I'll give you a story about the effectiveness of some of these medicines. Um, some scientists a few years ago attempted to recreate a recipe from the leech books. From Bald's leech book, there was a an eye salve that they tried to replicate. And so they follow all the steps for this eye salve to the extent in which they procure a copper cauldron. Uh, and they then create this eye salve, and really as sort of a joke, a gaffe of anything, they decided to test it against staph infections. And not just any staph infections, but antibiotic resistant staph infections. And they were thinking that it would be more of a joke than anything else,
Mm.
but it ended up working. And it was able to kill antibiotic resistant staph. And they still haven't been able to figure out exactly why it was able to do that. None of the constituent components um, should have been able to do it, but when you put them all together, for some reason it did. And so when we look at this recipe that was in this ancient magic book, because that's what this was, leechcraft is medical magic. That's how they saw it. It was medicine and magic were not separated
Yeah.
at that point in time. They were one and the same. So when one practiced the art of healing, that literally was magic. You were just doing it with herbs rather than necessarily with charms, or maybe you did it with charms and herbs. Who knows?
Yeah.
Um, but the thing is that nobody expected the level of effectiveness that you can get from some of these things to actually work. Now, we got to understand that not everything in here is going to be fabulous and wonderful.
Yeah, of course.
Um, there's a whole bunch of things in here that are completely backwards. For instance, the one that springs to mind is the cure for madness. One of them, there's actually several in the book. Um, one of the cures for madness was um, to make a scourge or a whip out of dolphin hide and then beat the mad person with it. Now, I really don't expect that to be particularly effective at curing someone of their of any of their madness. Um, and a cure for a woman being mad might have been to carry a bitter tasting herb under her tongue for a specified amount of time. Um, and so these things are not necessarily going to all be these truly effective things, um, but within the pages of the Leech Book, we actually do find things that are fairly effective. It's
Yeah.
just which ones are and which ones aren't. We don't know until we test them under modern day situations,
Yeah.
like they did with Bald's eye salve, and they didn't know that it would work. But the medicine that they were practicing was medicine, and it wasn't, like I technically it was witch doctor stuff,
Yeah.
but it wasn't witch doctor stuff because we would expect that to not work,
Yeah.
but it does.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And then, in a very similar note, we can take a look, go back to East Asia, and we can take a look at Chinese and by proxy, because China had heavy influence on places like Korea, Mongolia, Vietnam, and Japan. But look at Chinese medicine, and we can see very similar things. For example, everyone in our modern day is familiar with checking the pulse, like here or here. That was a thing that originated in Chinese medicine. That was something that the ancient Chinese and medieval Chinese came up with. Um, Among other things that I'll get further into in a little bit, but they also had very effective, of course, to varying different degrees, uh, herbal medicines. For example, for like berry, you had things like asparagus root or things like that, or a decoction of moistening the kidneys from the Tao and things like that. Sap from cinnamon boiled in liquor, etc., etc. Decoction of ginseng, with ginseng actually being probably one of the more effective ones because ginseng actually does have some degree of health benefits. Same with garlic, but they actually did, as you can see in this graph, try to figure out different ways to treat the various different illnesses. Night blindness, foot illness, poison and diarrhea, etc., etc. They were not just leaving it to things. Mugwort, ashes from mugwort. Mugwort actually has a lot of very varying health properties and things like that. And you can see this here. Pounding of vegetable leaves and things like that for
That's cabbage family.
Yeah, brassica. Thank you. Cabbage family. Um, uh, plant typhonomy and things like that is not my specialty. So for those of you watching, Beofeld, that's something else that's also more up Beofeld's alleys. I'm not. I don't know any of the scientific names for plants, so we'll bear with me on that one. Anyways, but pounding various different types of cabbages to cure like red poison or ulcers. Draw this one is obviously probably would not have worked. Draw the shape of a worm on the ground, take the soul from the abdomen part, mix it with saliva, and apply to the ulcer. I highly doubt that would have actually worked. But again, one of the ones that probably would have worked, to some degree, paste made from dandelion, because dandelion tea, it was a very common folk remedy.
All
So
right.
yeah,
So let's pause for a second, and I'll also bring something else into this.
yeah,
Some of these things that are magically based might actually have worked too. Just
yeah.
bear with me for a second.
Okay.
The human body has the ability to get rid of warts. Um, but the person has to believe that they can get rid of
Oh,
warts.
yeah.
If they don't believe they can get rid of warts, they're not going to go away. And so if you they've done studies where they would take this like little like what I've always seen is like a card that's shaped like a toad,
Oh,
and the doctor would rub it on the wart and say, now your wart's going to go away. Well, the person
oh,
believes that their wart's going to go away because the doctor tells them their wart's going to go away, and then what does that wart happen? The
it
wart goes
goes.
away
Yeah,
because the body can heal its own warts. It's just it has to be able to be tricked into doing it.
and
This
that's
ulcer
fair.
thing might be the same thing. The
Yeah,
doctor says the ulcer is going to go away because of the magic thing that they've done, and maybe the ulcer goes away. This placebo effect is a real thing.
yeah, and that's fair, and that's very fair. And so yeah, so much like the Leech books, the Chinese, uh, these were actually doctors. They went by healers or doctors rather than like say um, cunning person or things like that you might hear more in Europe. Um, but yeah, they were coming to sort of they were trying to cure some of the very same things or similar things using sort of very similar recipes and very similar ideas. So there is that, and of
I
course they
love
were
the note that's on this one, though. You see this
yeah,
note, son tried other recipes which did not work. This
yeah,
one worked, though he did not understand why.
yeah, yeah, exactly. You know, exactly. Or son learned the recipe from elder people, and things like that. Um, but also another thing, in many ways, East Asian medicine was leaps and bounds ahead. Again, many of the medical techniques that would eventually arise in, like, say, the Italian Renaissance were imported from China. Actually, that brings us to our next thing, in a lot of ways, medieval Islamic medicine, because again, the Islamic caliphates, the Islamic kingdoms, when they took over the parts of the Eastern Roman and Western Roman Empire, they inherited many of these cities that had actually been upkept by the Byzantine Empire, as well as the Visigothic kingdoms, and so they inherited a lot of medical knowledge, and scientific knowledge that they began to build upon and improve upon, like you see here. Much of our medical knowledge, modern medical knowledge, that didn't come from East Asia, came from the Muslim kingdoms. So that's something that's important to remember. Now, not all of it, of course, like Beofeld pointed out, a lot of our folk medicine, and modern medicine in some ways came from, sorry, a lot of our modern medicine came from folk medicine of places like England and such as well, but a good chunk of it came from the Islamic kingdoms. And while we're on the subject of China and the Muslim kingdoms, many of the medical treatments, and herbs that were used in medieval Islamic medicine actually were imported from China. You can see that in this list right here, and in this paper that just says the use of Chinese herbal drugs in Islamic medicine by, and I apologize for butchering this to anyone of Arab and Muslim descent for most definitely butchering this, Mojtabi Hidari et al. But in this paper by Mojtabi Hidari et al., they talk about the medical, the herbal drugs imported into medieval Islamic kingdoms from China, and these things included things like wild ginger, nutmeg, and cinnamon, rhubarb, incense trees, etc., that would be used to treat things like, say, in the case of wild ginger, relieve joint pain, which actually is something that you can do to this day. Wild ginger is very good for joint pain, and is actually talked about by doctors. But also nutmeg, which can help with dysentery and diarrhea. Cinnamon can help with colds and things like that, etc., etc. So that's why I think it's important to point out that this idea that medicine didn't exist in the medieval period, or there was a lack of medicine, or people were backward, which, you could argue one way or the other on the definition of backwards, especially compared to our modern world where we have things like, vaccines. But medicine did not go away when the Roman Empire fell. It continued to exist and would be built upon by medicine that was developed by the Islamic kingdoms and things that were imported from East Asia, as well as will be continued to be built upon by Christian kingdoms like the Anglo-Saxons. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
Let's see. I would just add that you take away our antibiotics and you'll see
yeah,
you'll see a resurgence of all of the same things come back again.
yeah,
Simply because we are the way we are because of the technology that we have worked ourselves into.
yeah.
But
Exactly.
our system of medicine today is completely and totally dependent upon antibiotics. And with antibiotic resistance on the rise, we'll just have to see how this goes in the future. But
Yeah,
we shouldn't necessarily think of some of these remedies as backwards,
no,
or even primitive, because they're extremely scientific for their time. They just didn't have antibiotics,
yeah,
and so you're going to have a higher death rate because of that.
yeah.
Um, you
Which,
know, just is the way that the world worked.
yeah, which actually brings, also, before I go on to the next section, we also have medical manuals from the Arabic world where we can see things used for surgery, like you see here in the surgical treatise by Al-Zawahiri, where you see scalpels and things like that. So they were already practicing some form of medical surgery uh, during this period of time, really in all the areas. Because again, go back to the first picture in for Europe, and you see them dissecting and really trying to figure out how the human body works. But it also existed in the Islamic caliphates as well, and they had medical manuals talking about that. But now talking about uh,
Is that dude getting trepanation done?
yes, it is. You know, talking on that same subject about you know, we didn't have, oftentimes medical things we were not, necessarily to the same level as in modern times, but could be very effective. Uh, we look at we can actually take a look at the Americas again, where cultures in Mesoamerica and South America were practicing brain surgery fairly early on, trepanation as it's called. And it was practiced in a very wide area. It was practiced in the Maya region and in the highlands of Mexico and in South America, as you can see in this area here. And we have quite a lot of archaeological evidence for it, as seen in this skull that I believe comes from the Inca Empire, um, and things like that. And studies have actually been done on pre-Columbian trepanation, as described in this paper by David S. Kushner et al., where they examined the success rates of pre-Columbian brain surgery. And what they found is that for the most part, the success rate of brain surgery in especially their study area was South America, but in South America during and before the Inca Empire, the success rate for brain surgery was around 75 to 91% success rates. Now there were some varying variations, like in from the period of 400 to 200 BC or BCE, it was about 40%, and from the period between 1000 to 1400 AD/CE, it was about 53%. So there was some variation on that, but by and large, the success rate seems to have been really high. Again, 75 to 91% success survival rates, which is huge. To put this into context, if we look right here, and you can pause to read this, the success rate for the same types of brain surgery conducted in the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865, that was only between, I believe it was like 46 to 56%. Oh, sorry, no. Yeah, the average mortality rate was about 56% for the same kind of surgery several hundred years further in time than in the Inca Empire and beforehand. So, again, like this medical science during the medieval period, and yes, the Inca Empire was a medieval kingdom. It arose in 1438, which was most definitely during the medieval period. But so like medieval medicine was not backwards in any way. I mean, this to have a 91%, 75 to 91% success rate before the invention of things like, say, for example, anesthesia or X-rays or things like that is huge. But it happened. So I think that's something that's important to point out. And if we look at that in the bigger context of Chinese, Islamic, and European medicine, we begin to see a big picture of, while these medicines were not necessarily as effective, as say modern medicine, they were still really effective. And there was a reason that they were used for so long. So, before I move on to the next section, do you have anything you want to add to that, Beofeld?
Oh, I just think it's wild. It's awesome.
Yeah, yeah,
The idea of trepanation being a successful thing under those circumstances is pretty amazing. And I've seen the healed skulls because you
Yeah,
can look in the skulls here. There's
yeah,
new bone growth. The
yeah,
person has obviously survived the procedure.
yeah,
And so it's just it's pretty awesome.
yeah, exactly. So yeah, so I mean, I really think we need to do away with this whole idea of the medieval period did not have medicine. You know, people were just dying, and being told, "Oh, if God, if I'll do this very minor thing, and if it doesn't work, God wanted you to die." Well, we need to do away with that because that's not how it actually worked in any part of the world. Like we have shown in all parts of the world. I mean, I didn't include Africa necessarily, and that's
They
uh,
had their own medical traditions. They were doing the same
yeah,
stuff.
they were doing the same stuff. We only have so much time in this video, so and we will talk about Africa in a little bit. But we begin to see the same stuff happening, and also a lot of Islamic kingdoms were in Africa anyway, so it still counts. But yeah, it's we need to do away with this myth because it's it's not conducive, nor does it tell how medicine actually was back then. So, with that, we'll move on to our next section. This one's not necessarily that big of a myth. It can be pretty easily debunked by anything, but it's still a myth that we need to talk. A very common myth that we need to talk about: the lack of art. And this idea mainly stems around the idea that after the Roman Empire until the Renaissance period, art really was not complex, and it didn't it wasn't to the same caliber, or
Well,
didn't exist at the same level or same quantity as the Italian Renaissance. And that's not the case. We see all kinds of examples of European art that like you see here of this university, which we'll talk about in just a couple of sections. uh, we see beautiful Chinese art, as seen in this sort of landscape painting from I believe, the Tang Dynasty. Um, we of course see all kinds of Islamic art, like seen here, uh, and going to the Americas, we see a huge number of Maya, Aztec, say Moche is being a pre a pre-Inca Peruvian Empire, things like that. We see beautifully carved out shell gorgets in Mississippian cities like Cahokia and Etowah and Moundville, as well as copper uh, animals and figurines that were hammered out by the Mississippian culture as well. We also see Anglo-Saxon examples of art. Uh, I believe this is the helmet or a replica of the helmet from the Sutton Hoo burial. Correct me
it
if
is.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, which, as you can see, is very intricately designed and has all kinds of beautiful art. This is most definitely art, just because it isn't, say, David or uh, the mural painted by Michelangelo and things like that doesn't change that it's art. Same goes for this gold. I believe it's a brackettie or a belt clip, um, but this gold inlaid piece of jewelry here, which again is art. Art isn't just paintings or statues. It's anything that is visually appealing and is created to portray that, to exude that. I mean, this helmet was probably not worn in battle. Is probably either for status or for burial or both. You know, uh, because you wear art for the art of it. You create art for the art of it. It's not. It's the same reason that you can buy a replica sword that's for decoration, but not use it in combat. You can buy it to hang on your wall, but it's probably not going to do as well as one that is, maybe a little bit uglier, but is much sturdier and things like that. The same goes for armor and things like that. Now we move on to our next section, which is, again, a very common one, but it's also one that can be pretty easily debunked, uh, much like the art, and that's the lack of education. For one thing, what the heck? Okay, hang on a second. Oh, there we go. Yeah, for one thing, you had things like if we go to China, which actually has the oldest continuous like public education system, period. You see things like the imperial examination system, where you would take various different examination systems in sort of a tiered step, like you see in this picture here, starting by the county, maybe as in like a child or a student, then you go to college, and then et cetera, all the way up. And these will be massive exams, like massive testing sites. And so, with looking at that, and we take a look at China's curriculum, you see things develop like government schools, which were sort of the big, private schools that provided curriculum that included things like Confucian, a study of Confucian and Taoist classics, study of medicine, law, and mathematics, calligraphy, astronomy, calendrical science, divination, ritual, basically everything you would need uh, in a high status setting. These were generally things that were taken up by people who eventually become members of the literati or the aristocracy. With peasant schools having curriculums that were sort of similar but also very different. They included things like rudimentary reading and writing and arithmetic, and then families would generally pass down like knowledge based off of what the family trade was, such as agricultural knowledge, crafting, sword making, brewing, etc. And then after you've done the government and peasant schools, boys from both of these could eventually, if they were well learned enough, go try the imperial examination, or the civil service examination, as it's more often called, which was administered for the purpose of selecting candidates for the state bureaucracy. They were tested on the knowledge of writing, Chinese classics, and literary style. Or alternatively, you could go into the military. You could take the military examinations, which were actually started during the Tang Dynasty, and were administered for the selection of army officers as a response to the breakdown of garrison militias preceding the Tang Dynasty. And so the military exam would include things like, of course, a written and physical portion, with the written portion being very similar to the civil service examination, where you would have to memorize and know, like, you would have to know to a T what the Confucian and Taoist classics said, as well as you would have to know and have memorized and mastered the art of war, and then you would have to show your prowess in martial skills such as archery, horsemanship, how skilled you were with a sword. You would, need to show your physical fitness with wrestling and things like that. So this, in many ways, this was a much more cohesive and much more complex education system than you would see in the Islamic and Christian kingdoms. But it was also in many ways very constraining, because if you didn't pass the civil service examination or military examinations, you would still be just essentially a peasant who would be working on the family trade. It was nowhere near as let me put it this way: it was much more upwardly mobile than a lot of parts of the world, but it was nowhere near as upwardly mobile as, say, the modern American or English education system is. I'll put it that way. And the sources I used for this were China's Golden Age, Everyday Life in the Tang Dynasty, pages 253 through 261. And here's just a little graph of sort of the idea of what the Chinese education system was used for. And it was like used to uphold the balance of the sort of four, what's it called? The four jobs, or the four, integral parts of Chinese society, which included things like the scholars, which were followed by the peasants. The scholars and peasants were the most important. The peasants because they provided food and things like that. And then the artisans, who were lower on the food chain because they didn't actually provide much to society. They just sort of sold things. They made pots and things like that. So they were a little bit more productive than the merchants, who did not produce anything themselves, but they were less productive than the peasants. And the merchants were completely on the bottom because, of course, they didn't produce anything themselves. They just sold other people's work. So in Chinese society, it was seen as, uh, the low man on the totem pole and useless. Then we have Aztec and Triple Alliance schools, where we can see things like the Kalameca, which was the religious academy that was attached to a temple. So it's only put it this way: the in Mesoamerica, especially under the Aztec Triple Alliance, which again was a medieval kingdom and empire, boys had options for two schools. The sons of nobles were sent to the Kalameca, the religious academy, where they were trained to be a priest. Though non-elite individuals, if they were talented enough, could also go there. And here they would study things like science, astronomy, art, writing, calendars, math, medicine, law, government history, architecture, public speaking, and religion. Meanwhile, most non-elite boys would go to the military schools, the Tepakli, where they would be taught history, religion, agricultural skills, military fighting techniques, and a craft or a trade, preparing them for life as a farmer, metal worker, feather worker. And yes, I did mean to put feather there, not leather. They worked with feathers as well as leather. Anyways, potters, or to be a soldier. Athletically talented boys would then be sent to further military training. Other students would just go back to their family life. Girls would also be taught because, unlike China and Europe, which let me go check if I got Europe here. Okay, good. I do have them there. But because unlike China and Europe and Islamic kingdoms, Native American cultures were by and large much more egalitarian. They were not. Well, yeah, no, they were pretty much about as egalitarian as you could get. So girls could actually go to school in these kingdoms, and so in the Aztec Triple Alliance, girls would attend school, not the same as boys, but they would attend the school where they would be instructed in things like housekeeping, religious tradition, and history of the empire. They would also be taught things like how to dance and poems for different religious festivals and different songs. So it was again, much like China, it was a much more cohesive and much more upwardly mobile education system than, say, Europe or the Islamic world. Not nowhere near as upwardly mobile again as the modern education system, but comparatively much more upwardly mobile. And again, the sources I used for this was the Handbook in the life of in the Aztec world, page 464, as well as the Kalameca and Tepakali in pre-conquest Tenochtitlan, which was a chapter in the work of Bernardino de Sahaguin, a pioneer ethnographer of the 16th century Aztec Mexican people, pages 169 through 177. And here's a graph showing their different choices for school here. This is from one of the Aztec books, actually. All right, now we're going to go back to the European and Middle Eastern world. So, while education in the Christian world was not as upwardly mobile as, say, Native American or East Asian education systems, they still existed. The education systems in the medieval Christian world still existed. And in fact, it is from them that we get the phrase university, because Christian universities existed. Christian universities had various different curriculums. The course of study generally included, generally took 6 years to get a master's degree, with a bachelor's degree being completed after the 3rd or 4th year. Sounding familiar, modern students? With the first couple of years, generally education was conducted in what is known as the trivium, or the lower division of the Sabine liberal arts, which comprised 3 of the subjects that were taught first. The 3 subjects that were taught first: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And then the second curricular stage, the quadrivium, is where you would begin to learn things like arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And then also at the quadrivium, sorry, at the quadrivium, you were taught things and prepared to eventually get a master's degree, or a degree of Master of Arts. And the source I had used for this was the History of the University in Europe, Volume 1, Universities in the Middle Ages, specifically Chapter 10, the Faculty of Arts. So, do you have anything you want to add to this, Beofeld?
No, I think that that was pretty good. The idea of university, really, we just have to understand that that all that we have today is built on that foundation.
Yeah,
They didn't spring out of nowhere.
yeah,
So,
exactly.
all of those were even based off of older models too.
Yeah.
They didn't spring out of nowhere either.
Nope. In fact, most European universities were in large part based off of the earlier medieval Muslim madrasa schools that were established first. With madrasa essentially they were essentially the same thing as universities. They were just called madrasas. And you can see the curriculum in these schools was very similar, but also very different in many ways to European universities, as described in this paper by Fermin Sanchez Barria, titled Education and Muslim Culture in Medieval Arab Madrid, where things that were taught in these madrasas included things like primary education for kids ages 6 and up, and then you could go into higher education where they would be taught specialties such as study of traditions or the readings of Quranic texts. They would be taught things on how to like conduct court and judicial practice. Of course, they would be taught things like literature and medicine. They would be taught philosophy, astronomy, and music. And they would also be taught linguistic studies, especially in Spanish custom. I mean, in Madrid. Madrid is in Spain. So these were much like European universities, were very complex education systems. Again, nowhere near as upwardly mobile as East Asia or Native American education systems, but they were still complex in their own right. And anyone in theory could go to a university or madrasa, but it was also dependent on wealth and status. Oftentimes, it was more like nobles who would go there, or the sons of nobles, because again, women could not generally go there. To a point. I mean, women were much more upwardly mobile and had much more freedom in the medieval period and in medieval Europe than we like to give them credit for. But at the same time, they still were constrained by the customs of the time.
We like to give them credit for having. So they had more than we like to give them credit for, but they didn't have very much.
No, yeah, exactly. They didn't have very much, but they had a little bit more, especially when it comes to like marriage, because marriage was which is something that we could also do that I've not included in this video. But the long and short of it, marriage was nowhere near as, at least for the lower classes, was a much more free thing. Because you could generally, like the way it was described to me by one of my college professors who was a medieval historian, as like you could essentially, you and a woman and a man could go off and consummate in the woods by themselves, and then they would just consider themselves married, and you could divorce fairly easily from that. Where the complexities and like strictness of marriage comes in the Middle Ages is in the noble classes, because oftentimes marriages between kings and nobles and lords were political marriages, and so you could not
They
tell
came with
daddy.
strings attached.
Yeah, with strings attached. You could not tell daddy no. That's not how that worked.
Well,
Like,
not only that, but you'll make father-in-law very angry if you
yeah,
decide to put off his daughter.
yeah, exactly, or son. Like, but daddy, no, I don't want to marry Prince such and such for of Spain. It's like, sorry, hun, we need it. I need his alliance to beat uh to beat the Germans. It's like that's not how this works. So yeah. Now, all right, so now is our next section, which I would argue, again, this is one of the three. This alongside lack of this alongside the knights in shining armor and the Dark Ages, I would argue is one of like the big three, and lack of medicine is like one of the big three or four myths of the medieval period. The lack of hygiene. And this is because of things like, oh, I don't know, I may have dropped the bomb a little bit earlier, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where our depiction of the medieval period is like, oh, everyone was dirty and, mucky and had drab, dark, colorless clothes, like you see here in this clip from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But again, that is not true at all. For one thing, in medieval Europe, well, in the whole world, but first looking at medieval Europe, bathing was practiced. Now, it wasn't practiced as much as other parts of the world. Bathing was generally like monthly in a lot of places, rather than, say, in some cases like in Scandinavia, which is part of Europe, but it was a little bit different, where you would bathe once a week. But regardless of that, whether it was monthly or weekly, bathing was still practiced. In fact, in Europe, there were a lot of bathhouses in cities, like huge bathhouses. Now, these were not necessarily very hygienic in themselves, because you can see it was a lot of people bathing together, and a lot of practices. For example, in the Roman Empire and into the medieval period, there was a practice of where you had a bucket with a sponge in water that was essentially the poop sponge, where you would just you would just clean your butt and then stick it back in the water, and it was a communal poop sponge.
This is how you get butt worms.
Yes. So Europe was in many ways, not hygienic, but it was nowhere near as unclean and unhygienic as people think it is. I mean, again, bathing was practiced, bathhouses were prominent. Also, toilets existed. A lot of people, when you hear things like, oh, a common thing is like, oh, they would just dump their fecal matter and their waste out into the streets. That was a thing that was common more towards the Georgian and Victorian era and things like that. I mean, it did happen, but it was
you had to have cities for that to happen. That's part of the thing.
Yeah,
and we don't have the rise of cities until a little bit later.
A little bit, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But it was still, even when cities began to rise, it wasn't that common until much later, when cities began to reach,
critical mass.
Yeah, critical mass. But so toilets did exist. And so here's a graph showing all the different cleaner supervisors or bathhouses in Ghent. And you can see they're pretty spread out. I mean, there are some over here, some over here, some over here. I mean, they were available to anybody who was in a city. And if you were in a small village, you maybe not you would maybe bathe in a stream or such, but that wasn't very common, because you could get sick from the bacteria in river and stream water, and things like that. But bathing was very much practiced in cities. Not only that, soap existed. Soap definitely existed. It was not a modern invention. Even in villages where you didn't bathe you bathed very rarely, you would still wash your hands and your face and such using these soaps that were made from lard and herbs and things like that. Basically, any kind of like homemade soap that you can buy even in stores to this day, that's what these were. Now, there were some recipes that in Beofeld, I don't know if they determined why this was the case, and you may know that, and if you do, feel free to chime in. But there was an ingredient that for the longest time, people, modern historians have not been able to figure out why it was this very specific ingredient. But in these soaps, they would use the urine of a man. Now, I'm not talking about the ammonia. I want to make this very clear. Urine has ammonia, and yes, it has cleaning properties. No, it was very specifically in these ingredients the urine of a man, not urine, the urine of a man. It had to be a man's urine. And modern historians have not been able to figure out why it's specifically a man's urine and not just any urine. You know, it's like, why a man? Like, why is it specifically a man's urine? You know, not, why does it have to be a man's and not say a woman's or something like that? But regardless, it was in there and it's very interesting. And regardless of whether or not why that existed, it still was an ingredient in soap, which existed, and soap was used in high quantities in bathhouses and to wash your hands and face and such in villages. And also, you would change your clothes. People did not like wearing dirty, smelly clothes. Whether or not you bathed, you could still change your clothes and wash them and put them back on, and put on clean clothes because dirty clothes also promoted disease. So with that, I'm going to pass that off to Beofeld to see what his thoughts on this are and to see if he has an explanation for why it had to be the urine of a man.
I don't know off the top of my head. I could give a guess.
Okay.
And my guess would be that potentially it was one of those issues where maybe it was originally man as in mankind
Maybe.
and
Yeah.
and then got messed up over time. Who knows?
Yeah.
Um, but it also might be that the soaps were made by men, and so that
Yeah.
the guy that wrote the recipe was like, all right, I'm a man, I make the soap. Um, but as for there being a particular property that men's urine would have that women's do not, I can't think of anything that,
Yeah.
pee is pee, but also pee was it was used in a lot of cleaning
Yeah.
things, whether that be in the production or cleaning of cloth
Yeah.
or a lot of stuff. And so we might be a little bit squicked out because of the P aspect, but there's a lot to be said for they had reasons why they were doing it. It actually
Yeah.
does have some cleaning properties.
Exactly. And then, like I said, to go to take a look at toilets, like I said, toilets existed in medieval Europe. Um,
Worst job ever, right
yes,
there.
that's
That
what I'm
dude
about to
right
get
there.
into. I was about to get into that in a second. But yeah, so toilets were essentially porta potties. They were built into these rooms in the walls. They were called privies or whatever other definition depending on your country. But they were essentially built into these walls where you had a seat that you would sit down on, do your business, and it would go down a hole either into a pit like this or just plop out of this area uh, onto the ground. And you would have people, they wouldn't just leave it there to rot. You would actually have people, probably very low status people, to come and clean this out. Like Beofeld said, probably the worst job ever. This is not something that a lord or even a court official would do, like an advisor or something like that. It was probably some poor, peasant who needed extra money or something like that, who began working at the castle, who was told by not even by the king or the nobles, but by the advisor himself, it's like, hey, go clean that out, kind of thing. So, but
All right.
oh yeah, go
So
ahead.
let's add to this for a second.
Yeah,
This is not waste.
yeah,
What we're looking at here is fertilizer.
yes, that's another good point. That is another
Uh,
very good point.
and so this particular type of fertilizer is one which we in our Western society no longer utilize. Um, but it's one that has been and continues to be utilized in some parts of the world, but we don't call it human manure. We call it night soil.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah,
So this person is collecting night soil for composting.
yeah,
They would compost it. and then that would be used to grow their crops.
Yep.
So um, we have to understand that these people were um, sustainable,
Mm.
sustainable in ways that we simply are not. If we think about all of the nutrients that we lose because we don't utilize the composting of our night soil even to this day, that's a lot of nutrient loss that goes into the system
Yeah.
that just is not reclaimed. Um, but uh, when I was teaching Africa, Asia, Middle East, I had this particularly nice set of slides that I would show, um, which were about the production of rice in China.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's a very good point, and that's actually how a lot of Chinese cities with massive populations that we'll get into in a minute kept clean, and also a lot of European cities as well, is they would take the waste from the streets and would use it for that fertilization. That's
yep.
a very good point to bring up. So
But definitely a bad job to have.
yes, yes,
And I will go ahead and point out that one of the main reasons that we don't do this today is because of the ability to catch communicable illnesses from the poop.
yeah,
Um, so we don't catch illnesses very well from animal feces because that would be a zoonosis.
yeah,
But we are really good at catching diseases from other humans. And so there is a reason why we don't utilize night soil as a fertilizer in today's world as much.
mhm,
But you know that we could.
yeah.
We just don't because of that reason.
Well, and I will say that something that I was taught in one of my classes in college on sustainability and things like that is you can to a point if you use treated uh, wastewater, like if it goes through a sewage treatment plant, it still holds a lot of that, you know, waste, but it has been treated to a certain degree, so it is safer than if you just took it right out of the, like the privy here on the screen. Um, it's just also you have to be sure to it's much more effective and much safer to use it on, say, like root vegetables, like say carrots or potatoes or rice or something like that, than it
Than
is
leaf.
say than
Yeah.
leaf vegetables like say wheat or lettuce or something like that. But you also it's still also somewhat safer because you can just wash it thoroughly and it'll be relatively safe. So that's something to point out as well. Also, I do want to add on to like we were talking about with the taking of the waste. Much like China, with cities like Chang'an and Hangzhou, where they would clean the streets and take the waste for agricultural use, they would do that in European cities as well, and so that's why up until the Industrial Revolution, where agriculture became less important in places like England and France and such, that's why you don't really see the uh, throwing out your bucket of waste into the street as much until the Industrial Revolution because of the use of waste for agriculture. So I think that's something to point out. Then we go to China, and again, very much like the education system in East Asia, hygiene was a much more important and serious thing taken. For again, bathing was taken very seriously, personal bathing, but also they had bathhouses, like seen here. This is a Tang Dynasty era bathhouse that a lot of people in cities would go and partake in. And they did have a form of soap. Now, it's not the sort of soap like you would see with the balls and like the homemade soap using like animal fat and herbs and things like that. The type of soap that was used in China, in medieval China, was actually sort of like a shower gel thing. So what they would do is they would take soybeans and various other types of beans and would mush them sort of into a paste that would remove the waste. It was their version of soap, and in fact, it's something that you can still buy to this day. Bath beans are still a thing. Soybean detergent. So again, what they would do is they would just mash up into the sort of gel-like paste and would use it on their body and hands and such, in conjunction with baths to wash off the dirt and waste and other things on their body. So yeah, this was not a dirty region at all. I mean, of course, if you were in a much more far-flung village, you might not have access to this, but you would still bathe and things like that. And the art much more complex. Sorry, let me phrase this. China arguably had a much more complex um, bathroom system. In fact, they had entire urinal areas in places like temples, as you can see here. These are like designated urinal areas. So, like our modern bathrooms, where you can come in. Modern men's bathrooms, where you can come in and you can see the toilets, but also the urinals. Yeah, China had that as well during this point in time. So they had regular bathrooms or regular latrines, like you see here in this depiction, all lined up, or you could go and just stand over a hole and use it as a urinal. So China was, again, like very modern in a lot of ways based off of their technology and the things they had. So their hygiene, again, was in most ways leaps and bounds ahead of Europe. And, and the same goes for Islamic kingdoms. Islamic kingdoms very similarly had much more pronounced hygiene practices. Bathhouses were pretty much endemic throughout all of the Islamic world, as you see here. And they had various different types of latrines and things like that. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, because it's essentially very similar to the East Asian hygiene practices. I'm not going to beat a dead horse and go over that all over again. Essentially, take what you saw in China and look at the Islamic world, and they were very similar with a few minor differences. So, and the Islamic world, again, also used soap, very similar to Europe. They used, again, basically, I'm not going to beat the dead horse. Their ingredients and recipes were very similar to European ingredients and recipes, of course, with the exception of the
man pee.
Yeah, the man pee. Oh, actually, I want to go back a second. So going back to Chinese hygiene. So there is I'm just going to read your recipe. Okay, so then in Chinese see here, what was it? In Chinese hygiene, one of the ways, so China came up with a lot of different ways to protect their body and to remain clean and healthy. They really wanted to make sure that they were not dirty in any way. Let's see, where's that recipe here? And they came up with rather interesting ways to do this. Let's see, where's this? Where is that? Let me pause this a second. So one of the ways that people in ancient China tried to keep clean and healthy was rainproofing their clothes, because they were worried about wearing clothes that were drenched, causing sweat, cause sores and rashes and itchiness and things like that. So they came up with a very interesting solution to this. Now, I am reading here from the book that I quoted about life in ancient China, China's Golden Age, Everyday Life in the Tang Dynasty. And we turn to page 104, where it states that see here, peasants wore raincoats made out of reeds and straw that hung down from their necks and covered their bodies. The well-to-do used oil clothing to protect themselves from downpours. A collection of medical prescriptions had a bizarre formula for waterproofing cloth. Uh, Place spiders, yes, you heard right, spiders, in a pot and feed them pork lard for 100 days. Then kill the arachnids and rub the grease exuded from the remains on a towel. Presumably, the towel was placed on the head during storms. And again, it goes on to say physicians warned that wearing clothes drenched with water and sweat caused sores, itchiness, and rash. And then they would also recommend changing garments immediately and such. But yeah, one of their remedies was apparently large spiders, which is I guess I can see it to a point, using the lard, and the fat to waterproof your clothing.
It's the
But
spiders that are
yeah, to be able to go back in time and be like, but why? Like, who
What
who's the
is the
first guy
purpose of the spider?
yeah, yeah. Oh, my clothes are drenched. Well, time to get out the large spiders and smush them on my clothes. So yeah, so
That's a pretty intense long-term thing though. Like you have to feed the spiders lard for a year.
yeah,
That's a long time that you're having to. Those would be some angry spiders by the time they come out of that lard bucket.
yeah, exactly. Okay, so now we're going to go into one of the next things: lack of urbanization. So oftentimes when we think of the medieval world, we tend to think of more ruralness, like the decline of cities in favor of rural areas. And while that certainly happened, it was not as prominent as one might think, because there were quite a lot of very large urban centers throughout the world.
London.
A lot of them. There was London, which was one of which along with Paris was one of like the most important cities in Western Europe. And it had a population that was fairly large. It varied from around 8 to 12,000 people around 700 CE or AD to around 40,000 people in 1100 CE or AD, and eventually reaching a population number of around 80,000 to 100,000 people in 1300 CE or AD. And all of these come from a very good book called Everyday Life in Medieval London. But all of that was completely dwarfed by the urbanization that was going on in China, where we begin to see the rise of very large cities and very important cities like Chang'an, the capital of the Han Dynasty and the Tang Dynasty of the medieval world. The Han Dynasty was like the Roman equivalent, China's equivalent to Rome. And later on in the 1200s, cities like Hangzhou. And these cities had massive populations for the time. Chang'an, during its height from 618 to 904 CE or AD, had a population of 1 to 2 million people. Again, the sources are China's Golden Age, page 46, and the New Book of Tang, chapter 1, and then the Historical Atlas of the Medieval World, pages 3.20 and 3.31. And then Hangzhou, during its height from 1089 to 1500 CE or AD, and really into the modern world, but we're focusing on the medieval period, had a population of around 900,000 to 1 million people. So these were massive cities that dwarfed anything in the Islamic and the European world. But with that in mind, Islamic cities like Cairo, for example, as seen here, still had a very large population. They talk about how the historians like André Raymond credit Cairo to having a population of around 500,000 to 600,000 people, give or take, during its height. So again, it was still much larger than a lot of European cities. And then if we go to North America, we can look at very large population centers, very large cities like Cahokia in what is now Missouri and Illinois, Etowah here in Georgia, and Moundville in Alabama, and we can see that they had populations that for a time even outstripped European cities. So, for example, Cahokia at its height in its main political center, here is seen on this map, had a population of around 10 to 15,000 people. This was during the same time period as London having a population of only 8 to 12,000 people. So if we look at just its like downtown Cahokia, we already see that it's rivaling, if not surpassing, London. But if we look at its outer suburbs, the villages that were still connected to Cahokia itself, but we're not, say, in the main political center, we get a population of around 40,000 people. So already in London's early years, in the medieval period, we have a North American city rivaling, if not surpassing, its population. We can see the same thing for cities like Mississippian cities like Etowah and Moundville, which were roughly the same size, where we see a population within their main sort of downtown, as we'll call it, of around 1 to 3,000, maybe 5,000 individuals. But if we look at the outer suburbs, as described by archaeologists such as David J. Hawley and James B. Langford, who is actually my mentor, my archaeological mentor, and I know him personally, his mentor. And we look at the sort of outer suburbs in the Etowah area, we see 54 54 main village sites. And looking at these sites, Halley and Langford were able to determine that each of these villages typically had several hundred people occupying it. Now, I know that's not a very specific number. However, I did consult with James B. Langford a few days ago on this question, and he gave me a much more specific estimate of roughly 300 to 800 people per village, depending on size. Now, of course, if we go back and look at this thing talking about the 54 villages, you had 54 sites, sorry. You had large villages, you had large mountain villages, large non-mountain villages, things like that, little farmsteads and hamlets. So there is some variation here, but if we take it at its bottom face value and we place each one of these villages, regardless of size, at 300 people, we still come out to a population of the outer neighborhoods, outer suburbs of Etowah and Moundville being around 10 to 16,000 people. So these city-states had populations of around 13 to 20,000 people when you take into account all the surrounding villages that were part of the Etowah Mounds. And this makes sense, or a part of Cahokia or Moundville. And this makes sense. After all, Beofeld here, how many suburbs exist for, say, San Francisco or Atlanta or New York, that are still taken into account when accounting for the population of each of those cities I just mentioned?
Geez, a lot.
Yeah. So too often we take a look at these centers and we're like, oh, they only had 10,000 people, or they only had, this or that. Well, if we take into account all of it, including the lower outer suburbs, they had quite a lot. So
the metro area.
Yeah, metro areas, yes. So, and far too often I hear, this is a little side thing I want to say, far too often I hear that Cahokia is the only true city in the Americas north of Mexico. I disagree. And most archaeologists actually disagree. That's a very sort of like National Geographic sort of thing to say. Like, most archaeologists and historians of North America disagree on that. Because again, Etowah and Moundville and other sites like Spiro and I believe it's Mississippi, or Arkansas, uh, point out that these were very large cities. They just were not as like densely populated, or sorry, not densely populated. Sorry, they weren't as like these cities were nowhere near as compact in terms of building structure as say like London or Paris. Doesn't change the fact that they had large populations and they were very much cities. They were just a little bit more spread out. Anyways, and here's just sort of an Cholula, and then we can go further south to Mexico and take a
Like the
look at
sauce?
yeah. What do you say?
Like the sauce?
Like the sauce, yes, Cholula like the sauce, yes. But look at the one of the earlier large population centers, large ceremonial centers, such as Cholula, uh, where we take a look at it, and we can see that Cholula, for example, which was a city that was very closely connected to another very large city, Teotihuacan, famous for its Pyramid of the Sun and Moon. And we take a look at it, and it had a population of around 30 to 50,000 people during its height, around 600 to 800 CE or AD, during the early post-classic period. So again, we're already seeing cities that are rivaling, if not surpassing, European cities in the Americas. We also can take a look at Tenochtitlan because, again, the Aztec Empire, or more properly known as the Triple Alliance, was also a medieval city, and it had a population of see here, where is that? It had a population of around 100,000 people. Oh, sorry, no, I worked more than that. It had a population of around 240 to 300,000 people. So it, at its height, Tenochtitlan at its height, surpassed London at its height during the medieval period. Like, like by 2 to 1, by 2 to 1 or 2 to 1 or 3 to 1, depending on whichever one you look at. If it's 240,000 or 300,000. So Tenochtitlan was one of the biggest cities in the world at the time, period. Again, nowhere near as large as, say, Chang'an or Hangzhou, which were huge comparatively, but very large. Though you can also have a more conservative figure of around 125 to 140,000 people, but even at the conservative range, it surpasses London at its height. So there is that. Then we can go a little further south still to take a look at Tiwanaku in Bolivia. Tiwanaku being a pre-Inca site, kingdom empire. There's some debate about whether or not it was an empire or a group of several city-states. But Tiwanaku was its center and is what the culture is named after. And if we look at its population, as talked about by Charles Stanish in his chapter in a book on Tiwanaku archaeology called What Was Tiwanaku? Tiwanaku had a population in its main downtown area of around 20,000 people, and probably much more. In fact, he goes on to say later on the paper that he thinks it was approaching at least 100,000 at this point in time. And we can look again at a very similar thing, moving now to Africa, to specifically the Kingdom of Mali and its capital Timbuktu, which you see here. And we can see that, again, we have a very large urban center. Now, I was not able to find any good graphs showing the population of Timbuktu at its height during the 15th century or the 1400s. But all estimates show that by the 15th and 16th century, the 1400s and the 1500s, Timbuktu had a population of around 100,000 people. This paper is the best example I could find of that, where it talks about how by the 16th century, fully a quarter of Timbuktu's population, or 25,000, were either students or masters affiliated with mosques and things like that. So if we take a look at saying like, oh, 1/4 of Timbuktu's population is 25,000, then therefore, by process of elimination, Timbuktu must have a population of around 100,000 people. So yeah, so no matter how you look at it, whether it be Europe, Asia, America, Africa, urbanization was a thing that was very much happening at a large rate, with, of course, varying rates, but still a very large rate, even in Europe. Uh, Now, the height of European urbanization didn't happen until the high and late Middle Ages, but it was still happening in the Middle Ages. Do you have anything you want to add before we move on to our last couple of sections, Beofeld?
Nope.
Nope. Okay. Cool. Now we move on to one of our next. I think what like the next to last section, lack of trade. Now this one is again a very easy one to debunk. It's not one that's it's one that's very common, but it's not one that it's like uh imposing. We'll put it that way. Like it exists, but it's more like, oh, those silly people, they were isolated and yada yada yada, and then somebody can be just like, well, what about the Silk Road or for something like that. So, which is exactly it. During the medieval period, trade was alive and well. Global trade was alive and well thanks to the Silk Road. The Silk Road connected Africa and Asia to the Middle East and Europe. Yeah, Africa would trade things like gold, ivory, and incense and spices like myrrh and things like that, and frankincense. Whereas Europe would trade things like glass, wool, olive oil, silver. India would trade spices like, say, turmeric or cinnamon, and precious gems like rubies and lapis lazuli. And then China would trade things like silk, bronze, jade, and horses. So it was a very interconnected world. And one of the most valuable trade goods was silk. Silk was the luxury item that everyone in the Middle East and Europe and Africa as well wanted. In fact, it was such a luxury good that at one point in time, Justinian the First of the Byzantine Empire actually sent emissaries to Tong, China, to commit what was essentially the equivalent of corporate espionage to get silk. So what I mean by that is silk was a trade secret of China. Imperial China absolutely refused to give anyone the recipe for silk. And in fact, during these diplomatic missions from Justinian, Tang China kept saying, no, we don't care. We do not care. You want the silk, we don't care. And then eventually, Justinian's successors, who sent more emissaries out, decided to just steal the silkworms. Now, normally, if they'd done it at any other point in time, they would have been caught and executed. But they had one thing on their side. Tang China was in a massive civil war called the Rebellion of Anlu Shan, where a Tang general decided, I want to be king too. And so he had most of the military force backing him, and he started a huge, 10-year-long war. And so because of the chaos in China, the Byzantine officials, diplomats, were able to make off with a few silkworm cocoons and make their way back to the Byzantine Empire and actually begin a Byzantine silk manufacturing economy. Now, that being said, Byzantine silk was nowhere near the quality of Chinese silk, which is why even after that, Chinese silk was the standard, and people would still make their way to China to try and get Tang or Sung or Mongol or Ming Dynasty silk. But if you could not afford that, Byzantine silk would do just fine. So before I move on to the next slide, just remember, corporate espionage is not a new thing either. It's a very old thing. Humans have wanted to, have done get rich quick schemes since we've existed. We'll put it that way. And then you have the trans-Saharan trade routes deep in Africa, especially West Africa, where you would get things where African kingdoms like the Kingdom of Mali and Ghana would trade, especially gold gold was very prosperous. Gold was very abundant in West Africa, and still is to this day. But they would trade gold, copper, salt, and things like that, and slaves. Now, let's keep this in mind. Just because it says slaves here is not the same thing as the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade is a very different beast from ancient slavery. That deserves a video in on itself, and will come eventually. So I'm not going to go into the full details on that, but I do want to make sure anyone seeing this is not at all the same as the transatlantic slave trade. Anyways, that aside, that out of the way, the sub-Saharan trade routes were essentially the African version of the Silk Route. Nowhere near as complex as the Silk Road, but it still was sort of like the number 2 trade route. We'll put it that way. You also had trade on the east coast of Africa with kingdoms like the Ethiopian kingdom of Aksum, which actually we have a very good evidence of that from Anglo-Saxon England, where in Anglo-Saxon burials they found ivory rings and other ivory artifacts, which they tested and found them to be from elephants located around the east coast of Africa, and most likely from the kingdom of Aksum, which shows that, for one thing, Anglo-Saxon England, while it was a little more cut off from the rest of European affairs than, say, the kingdom of France, say the Carolingian Frankish kingdom, it was in no way, cut off and unaware of what was going on in the world. Do you have anything you want to add into that, Beofeld?
Just that we have plenty of examples where things show up in places where you would not expect them.
Yeah.
All across the ancient world, and the Middle Ages is no different. In Norse hack silver, sometimes they had Arab coins.
Yeah.
And so those had to make their way across trade networks. Not necessarily a single individual would have gone from, say, the Anglo-Saxon areas to Africa, but that they traded hands with someone who traded hands with someone who traded hands with someone that went all the way there. These people had no idea generally where these things were coming from, only that they had developed an appetite for them.
Yeah, exactly. And same thing goes for the Helgo Buddha, which is an actual Buddha, not to be mistaken for that cup that has an individual that looks like the Buddha, but it actually isn't. The Helgo Buddha is a jade Buddha that comes from they tested did molecular testing on it, and it came from India. Same with a glass bead that was found to have originated in Gujarat, India, in Viking burials and things like that. So these were very connected people, and actually the best example of this comes from the transfer of medical and scientific knowledge during the Mongol Empire. So for those of you who maybe aren't aware, the Mongol Empire began a massive series of conquests, eventually resulting in the conquest of most of the known world. The Mongols conquered China, Russia, the Middle East, parts of India, not all of India, parts of Southeast Asia, Korea, etc. And eventually, when the conquest settled, the Silk Road, which had sort of been closed, not completely, but had been not as safe because of the collapse of the Tang Dynasty, was now safe again. The Mongols provided a stability because they were one. I don't want to say that they weren't necessarily one singular entity. They were sort of like the late Roman Empire, divided into 4 different khanates or hanates, because actually the K in front of an H is silent. That were sort of semi-independent, but still had some degree of loyalty to the main Khanate of the Great Khan. But regardless of whether or not they were separate, they still provided sort of a singular protection for traders. Traders were offered entire military garrisons to help them get across this trade route. And because of that, we begin to see the transfer of Chinese medical knowledge, as seen here, to the West, that began to be copied. In fact, copied pretty much to a T. You cannot tell me that there is other than the language, that there is a single difference between these Chinese medical texts here and these Persian medical texts here. Do you see a difference, Beofeld?
Oh, those are pretty direct copies.
Yeah.
The figure D is a more poorly copied one.
Yeah, it is a more poorly copied one, but for the most part, they're pretty direct copies. And the same goes for this. You see this illustration of a skeletal system from the Mansour's Anatomy, as well as the canon of Avicenna, meaning that it showed up in European, most likely Italian, and Spanish medical texts. And it, while it's not quite as well copied, it's still pretty clearly copied from this Chinese text that you see here. They copied them like pretty much one for one. And so these medical texts were then taken by people like, say, Leonardo da Vinci and other people, and were copied further into European schools, especially when a lot of people don't know that there was a crusade in Toledo where French knights went and captured Toledo, the city of Toledo, and took a lot of medical knowledge from it, and things like that. So because of the intermixing and exchange between Muslim caliphates and European Christian kingdoms, Chinese medical texts began to be transferred there as well. So we actually have the Mongol Empire in China to thanks, at least in part, for what would eventually become the Italian Renaissance. And again, that's pretty evident based off of this slide and this slide. And then we go to the Americas, and now I always like to point this out because while the book has become less prominent, it's still very prominent. So in the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, the author of it, who most historians have discredited his work because he's full of shit in a lot of ways, but in his book he talks about how, for whatever reason, according to him, trade did not happen, and like exchange of knowledge did not happen at the same level in the Americas because, and Beofeld, you probably haven't heard this, but and I quote, trade is harder to conduct north to south than it is east to west.
What other bullshit?
Yeah, utter bullshit. Because again, Asia and Africa, for one thing, is like longer up than it is, wide, and it's still pretty wide. So yeah, so that is utter bullshit, because we see quite a lot of evidence, a very robust trade network in the Americas during the medieval period, where Mississippian cultures in the southeast would, trade things like conch shells and wampum shells and flint in exchange for copper from the Great Lakes, pipestone from the Midwest and the West, obsidian from Yellowstone. People in the Southwest would trade things like turquoise and flint and such in return for obsidian and macaws from Mesoamerica. Like, it was very robust. So trade existed everywhere and was very complex everywhere in the medieval world. Now comes our last section. War, and this is a very common myth that is also pretty easily debunked. It's not, but it's also a little more common and proliferated than, say, lack of art or something, but it's nowhere near as common as, say, nice and shining armor. But it's like war was unsophisticated after the fall of the Roman Empire. So this myth is mainly propagated by movies like Braveheart, where you see two medieval armies just stand in a line for a couple of seconds and then decide to run at each other. And then it becomes utter chaos. That's not how war worked at any point in time. in really any part of the world. Um, so, for example, looking at Europe, at Western Europe specifically, there were actually military manuals that were studied by knights and common soldiers, which were called men at arms. So knights were the elite forces, but the main soldiers used by European armies were men at arms and things like that. Being meaning like you just take up arms to go join the army. But you would, especially the commanders, would consult military manuals. The most common in Western Europe being the De Re Militari, which was actually a late Roman military manual that had instructions and battle tactics involving, infantry formations and cavalry, but also on the creation and use of siege engines and like what siege engines were best used for, which scenario. So Western European armies were very well trained, and no, they did not run at each other. They conducted things like what is called a chevauchée, which is essentially you do a large raid into enemy territory and you burn as many crops and supply chains as possible. They conducted sieges. They had specific rules of battle, like archers would be protected by infantry in the front, things like that. These were not just running at people. And then if we go to Eastern Europe, we begin to see this basically this on steroids, because the Byzantine, the Eastern Roman or the Byzantine army was one of the top military forces of its day, and it had various different military manuals, like Maurice's Strategon, where they would describe the use of weapons like, I don't know, and has anyone ever heard of Greek fire? Yeah, this is where the ingredients and the instruction on the use of Greek fire comes from. So for those of you who don't know, Greek fire was essentially ancient napalm. We're not exactly sure on the recipe. There are some ideas, and some people have have tested it and recreated some version that may or may not be what the Byzantine Greek fire was. But regardless of whether or not we know what the exact ingredient was, the Byzantine Empire used Greek fire to very great effect, mainly in naval battles, where they would burn ships, but also, as you see in this manual, where they would build siege towers to essentially get up to the city walls and light the city walls on fire. And Greek fire could not be put out with water at all. You had to, from my understanding, you had to basically put it out like with a grease fire, with a blanket or something like that. So yeah, and of course they had things where it's like, oh, here's how heavy infantry works, here's how heavy cavalry works. They had specific strategies and rules that they based their military on in these manuals that were very Roman in style, because again, the Byzantine Empire was Roman, and such. Do you have anything you want to add into that, Beofeld?
I would say that that really what we see is a continuation of
Yeah,
the warfare tradition of Rome.
yeah,
The only difference is the scale.
yeah,
So as the empire is scaled down, you scale down the amount of forces that any individual group can mount. So you're not going to see the massive legions that you had of Rome. No, of course not, because you
yeah,
don't have the massive empire of Rome to create those legions. So it's more of the same. It's just scaled down.
yeah, yeah. And it's why, until really the Fourth Crusade, uh, the Byzantine Empire was able to hold on to much of its territory. Now, it did lose a good chunk of its territory to the Islamic Caliphates, and eventually the Bulgarian Empire and such. But during its height, up into and during the Crusades, the Byzantine Empire was actually making gains and retaking much of their lost territory. So this is why, because they were very methodical in the way they waged war and very advanced in a lot of ways. Again, they had the first kind of napalm. And then we also see, very similarly, we see this type of military training in Islamic military treatises called Furusiya. Now, Pharisee really are thought to have originated in the Abbasid Caliphate, but they really begin to take off and reach their height during the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt. And they would the Mamluks were they were one of the first sort of professional armies, like you would see in the modern world, that began to arise in the medieval period of the Western world alongside the Byzantine Empire. And there's a reason for this, and that's because they had to fight the most powerful empire in the world at the time, the Mongols. The Mamluks were one of the few empires that could really stand against the Mongol Empire. And part of that is because they actually took a lot of Mongol tactics and included them into their military training, which is really one of the few ways you could beat the Mongols, is by just essentially using their own tactics against them. But they used these tactics to become one of the most powerful militaries in the Western world. You would learn things like horse archery. You would learn how to properly use spears, various different kind of weapons. You would learn how to be professional soldiers. In fact, one of the things they taught their soldiers, again, going back to their fighting the Mongol Empire, one of the Mongol Empire's favorite tactics that we'll get into in a minute in more detail was a feigned retreat, where you pretend to run away, and then once the enemy's in disarray, they turn around and they start picking you and cutting you to shreds with their arrows. The Mamelukes trained their cavalry and their infantry to stay. They trained their cavalry and infantry to only move at the command of their general, which was, something that was innovative at the time, because again, the Mongols plowed through Eastern Europe, they plowed through China, they plowed through the Middle East up until the Mamluk Sultanate, and nobody was able to really beat them. Now, it's important to note that the European knights were able to fight to some degree against the Mongols, but the Mongols were still better trained and better equipped. The Mamluks were essentially the Muslim version of the Mongols, and so they were leagues better trained than European soldiers, and were equally as trained, if not a little bit better trained, than Mongol soldiers. So, which brings us, and they also focused heavily on horsemanship. In fact, there's a lot of diagrams of horses, like horse anatomy, like the best horses to use for cavalry and things like that in these Pharisee manuals. Then we can go to China and take a look at Chinese military treatises also. And we see very well thought out treatises like the Wujing Zongyao, where we see techniques on the creation and use of battleships, like you see here. And then we have later on the Huolong Jing, where we begin to see the talk about instructions on the creation and use of gunpowder weapons, like, of course, cannons, but also landmines. Yeah, the Chinese were already using landmines in the medieval period. They would, and water mines. They would use ship mines, where they would leave them dangling, and then would have a mechanism that would light them once ships got close, and they would blow up ships. The landmines they would bury under the ground in patterns like you see here, and if say an enemy army approached, like sometimes they would put weapons like in a mound as a trap, and some people would come up and remove them, and then boom, mines blow up around you and your army. But other times they would have long ropes or strings attached. They would obscure in foliage and such, and when an enemy detachment was coming close or passing over, the person in charge would just pull the string, and same idea, boom, mines and explosives would blow the army apart. And then we come to the Mongols, who used a variety of very early, tactics that were very similar to tactics used by early modern European cavalry. There are caracal tactics, which are essentially you run up, fire, and then go back to the line, and the next person behind you fires their arrows again, and repeat process, which is actually a tactic that was used to great effect by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Swedish Empire during the 30 Years' War and the Great Northern War of 1630 and 1700 CE or AD. So, like, during the time of, Jamestown and the Plymouth colony. They also used Fabian tactics, which those of you who don't know is essentially you attack the enemy on your terms. So you only attack when you have a strong position and the enemy has a weak position. Essentially, war of attrition, which is another very common modern military tactic that was adopted by European empires like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Swedish Empire, both of which had their techniques adopted by kingdoms like France and England. And then you also had the aforementioned feigned retreat tactic, which is pretty self-explanatory. You run away, you pretend to run away, and when the people follow you, you just turn around and cut them to shreds because now they're in disarray. Or they used something called the open-end tactic, where they would encircle an enemy and leave like a small gap in their lines, making the enemy think they could run through that gap and escape. And as they were escaping and fleeing, the Mongols would close this pincer and just rip them to shreds. Which is, again, a very common tactic that is one ancient. It's a tactic that Hannibal used a lot against the Romans. So it's not like a Mongol innovation, but it's a tactic that the Mongols used nonetheless and was copied by a lot of enemies who fought the Mongols. So there is that. And before I move on, do you have anything you want to add to anything I just said, Beofeld?
Just that what we do see as a rise here is the rise of the mounted combat.
Yeah.
When we look at the Mongols, when we look at the Caliphate, when we look at then even in Europe, mounted combat becomes the norm.
Yeah.
Whereas when we look during earlier periods of time, the legions, they did have mounted combat there, but they were elite.
Yeah.
The primary strength of the legion was its foot soldiers.
Yeah.
But here we see a shifting towards cavalry.
Yes. Oh, also another thing, the scimitar that we see, like people like in say the Last Kingdom, like Saladin and Muslim soldiers wielding, that didn't show up in the Middle East until the Mongols and the Turks arrived. The Turks also came from Central Asia. So before then, everyone in the Middle East and in Europe used straight swords, which is neither here nor there. It doesn't really change military tactics that much. It's just a fun little factoid to throw in there because we're in the military section. The scimitar and the saber is a byproduct of the Mongols and other Central Asian Turks, like, say, the Seljuks and the Khazars, coming into the region of Europe and the Middle East. Now we're going to go back to the Americas, and in North America, we see very different types of tactics. So, by and large, in the Americas as a whole, war took a very different shape. It was more based off of ambush tactics and things like that. In fact, individuals like De Soto and Tristan de Luna, who came through the Southeast in the 1500s, so after the Middle Ages, but it still counts because it was the same tactics that were used in North America before then. Warriors of the eastern woodlands of the Americas tend to emulate creatures that used ambush tactics, like the falcon or the serpent or the mountain lion. And so that's sort of the warfare we see. We see, rather than, lines of legions or, say, caracal tactics like the Mongols used, we see ambush sort of guerrilla warfare tactics being developed by peoples of the eastern woodlands and really all of North America. Also, warfare was by and large less lethal than in Europe or Asia, and in a lot of ways in Africa, and that's because warfare in the Americas by and large was more about one, it was about exacting tribute. So you wouldn't conquer a place, you would just wage a little war here or there, attack a couple of people here or there, and then you would be like, all right, we'll stop if you pay us. If you send us, say, obsidian or something like that. But it was also for one, it was for honor as well. Young boys would, uh, young men and boys would uh, go up in society, if depending on how skilled in war they were. Um, and we see this a lot with like things called counting coup, which is more prominent in the plains, but it's very similar still to the Eastern Woodlands, where you would gain more honor as a warrior based off of how many enemy soldiers you touched without killing them. And that's sort of what it was. In fact, European explorers like Jacques Cartier in Canada and such noted that by and large, Native American battles had very few casualties, and the same goes in the South American Southeast. Um, Most of the time when killing happened, it would be for things like, say, I kill, say, I kill Beofeld's brother, and so now he is obligated by blood law or something like that to come and kill a member of my family, or he would launch a raid and he would take captive a member of my family or village and then induct them into his family to replace the lost individual, which is something very different than what we see in Europe, the Middle East, and China, and in Asia. And here's just so you can pause and read. This is essentially just saying all the same things I just said. Though it should be noted that they did, as you can see in this paper, fortifications were used by the tribes of the Eastern Woodlands. They just weren't used in necessarily the same way as, say, a European castle or a Chinese fortress would have been. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Beofeld?
Just that while we didn't have the capturing of an individual to induct in your family as a typical portion in European stuff, they had different solutions, such as the advent of weregeld.
Oh, yes,
Uh,
Wergeld. That's another good point to bring up. Wergeld, yes.
so that's the European solution for ending a blood feud is weregeld.
Yeah. You real quick explain that because I know what it is, obviously. Uh, but you explain it for those of our viewers.
So, say you kill my brother, like the
Ah,
example that you gave. Um, Instead of being obligated for me to try and kill you, and then for someone else to be obligated to try and kill me, you could instead pay me the weregild, the price for a life that you then owe to me. And
yeah,
so you would essentially pay me off rather than having me go after you necessarily. You could pay me off, and that would essentially satisfy the commitment there. And it's not just a price for life; it's a price for anything. You kill my sheep, there's a price for
yeah,
that. You lame my hand, there's a price for that.
yeah,
And so Weregeld was an overarching system whereby um, instead of enacting grievances by killing someone, you essentially took them to court
yeah,
and made them it's essentially civil court.
yeah. Exactly. And to add on to that, so there's this thing called a. I didn't mean to say it twice. So there's this process called a thing, uh, where essentially a judge and a council come together in these cases, and there's some negotiation on the weregild, uh,
Yes.
and things like that. So yeah, all right. So with that, we're going to move on to our last part of the warfare thing. So we're going to go again and take a look at the Aztec Triple Alliance, because again, many of the empires that we know in the Americas, like the Aztec Triple Alliance or the Inca Empire, they arose during the medieval period. The Aztec Triple Alliance rose in 1428, and the Inca Empire arose in 1438, both of which were most definitely the medieval period. So, but we have the best military system, like the most well known, like the best studied military system of these groups was the Aztec Triple Alliance. And so the Triple Alliance, which is its proper name because the Aztec Empire was actually an alliance of 3 city-states, had a very complex military system where you would start out at one place, and depending on how many people you brought, so Aztec warfare, even when they were going and subjugating a city, and by subjugating I mean they would defeat a city and enact tribute from it. They would their warfare was not based off of who you killed. Again, killing was seen as sloppy to them. You as a soldier, while it could happen, you would actually have a sort of a demerit against you for killing. And that's an oversimplification. It's much more complex than that. But the long and short of it is it would be a demerit. You could not progress in the military hierarchy if, based off of how many people you killed. But if you brought in people alive, then you would start progressing in rank until you reach things like, say, the Jaguar Warrior or the Eagle Warrior or something like that, which is, again, very different from European warfare. And now it should also be noted that while human sacrifice did exist and part of bringing in captives was for human sacrifice, it was in no way to the frequency that like the Spanish talked about. That's propaganda. It was like a once a year thing. It was an annual thing, and it did happen, but it was not like they didn't kill people in droves. It was very specific scenarios. But if you brought in captives for, say, like tribute or something like that, that could also get you better in rank. Also, the Aztec Triple Alliance practiced something called called a flower war. So flower wars were these ceremonial wars where essentially city-states in Mesoamerica and Mexico, if they had grievances, they would agree to a predetermined location where they would send a predetermined number of warriors from each state, and they would essentially battle it out. And whoever won the argument, essentially. And again, by and large, they were typically less lethal than European wars. Now, people did die, but comparatively, it was nowhere near as lethal as, say, like, I don't know, the Battle of Agincourt. Yeah, the point of these wars and these battles was not, kill, kill, kill. It was like, okay, we've got an agreement. We're going to go, punch each other for a little bit, and whoever's knocked out first wins, and is the correct person or something like that. And again, that's a very oversimplification, but it's something along that lines. So I believe that is the last one. Yep. So with that, before we end the video, do you want to add anything to that, Beofeld?
Oh no, not particularly.
All right. Okay. So with that ends our video. And believe it or not, while we went into detail on those 10 myths, we could have even gone further with each of these. That was as compact as we could get it, while also still getting the point across. Because we could have gone even more compact, but then we would be missing details and nuances and things like that. So with that, I hope that we have sort of shown and educated people, you viewers, on just how fascinating and complex and advanced the medieval world was. Because again, it was not backwards at all. I mean, if we wanted to do it if we want to really be pedantic and be like, oh, it's backwards compared to the 21st century, it's like, fine. but then you can say that about any period in time before the 21st century, you know. so so it was comparatively to, like, say, the Roman period or ancient Egypt or something, it was by no means backwards. So that's where I'm essentially going to leave it, you know. Give some love to the medieval period. Do you have any final thoughts, Beofeld, before we come off?
Just that we have to separate ourselves from um, essentially what media is telling us, because media is oftentimes not portraying things accurately.
Yeah,
Whether it be the Vikings TV show or whether it be Braveheart, these are not intended to be accurate renditions. They're intended to be um, things that you watch and enjoy, but they're not intended to be historical.
yeah,
And we should not treat them as such. But the problem is that they end up flavoring how people see the past, and
yeah.
it's sort of a dangerous thing that is just something that we need to combat.
Mm, I agree. Which is, again, the point of this video.
Yeah.
You know, and again, we could go on into even more detail on the ones we talked about in this video, and we could go on and, you know, and talk about other ones, like, say, social class, or marriage or something like that. But, you know, we got to start somewhere, because otherwise we'd be here for 6 hours or 12 hours or 20 hours, and still not be done. So with that, thank everyone for watching this. I hope y'all learned something. Uh, and if you want to see us cover, me or both of us cover anything mentioned in the video in greater detail in later videos, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And remember to like, share, and subscribe. And thank you, Beofeld, for coming on with me again, and helping me talk about and debunk these myths.
Hey, anytime, man.
Yep. All right. With that, everyone, I hope you all have a good day.